You know that specific moment when someone mentions dinner, a weeknight, nothing special, just the end of the day arriving with the usual question. And the answer in the conversation is already moving toward the delivery app, the place around the corner, the restaurant that's always fine even when nothing else sounds right. And you think about your own answer before the question fully lands, which is that dinner is already decided. Not because you planned elaborately, because the kitchen is simply where dinner happens, the way it has always happened, the way it will happen tomorrow, without the question requiring a decision every time it arrives. While across the table, someone is opening an app, calculating delivery fees, estimating how long, asking if anyone has a preference, and not noticing that the evening's most expensive decision has already been made, quietly, without any of that. Here's what almost nobody calculates about eating out. The individual meal is never the problem. $25 for dinner is a reasonable amount to spend on a meal. Convenient, satisfying. Someone else dealt with the shopping, the preparation, the cleaning. On any given Tuesday, it represents a perfectly sensible exchange of money for time and effort. The problem is the Tuesday after that, and the weekend, and the work lunch that became a restaurant because the morning ran out before the kitchen did, and the Sunday when cooking felt like the kind of effort the day didn't have left to give. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that the average American household spends over $3,000 per year on food away from home, separate from groceries, separate from the food budget, a category that exists in its own accounting column as though it were unrelated to everything the grocery bill is already covering. And the gap between what a meal costs at a restaurant and what it costs to make it at home is not narrow. It is consistently 3 to 5 times larger per person, per meal, across categories and price points. A premium that accumulates invisibly because no single meal feels expensive in isolation. And the total is never assembled. Anywhere it can be seen. Nobody presents you the annual number at the point of ordering, the total that the year of individual, reasonable meals has been quietly building. You only meet it later, in the quiet arithmetic of a year where the food spending was larger than it looked, because the part that looked like experience was also the most expensive part of what was eaten. There is a name for why the restaurant always wins the comparison, even when the arithmetic is clear. Economists call it mental accounting. Research by Richard Thaler, who received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017, showed that people do not treat money as fungible. They assign spending to mental categories, and those categories have different emotional weights and different standards for what counts as acceptable. Eating out sits in the mental account, marked experience or entertainment. Grocery shopping sits in the account marked household necessity. These two accounts are almost never compared against each other directly, because the restaurant is not being evaluated against the cost of cooking the same meal. It is being evaluated against the pleasure and convenience it provides, and pleasure almost always wins. Always cooking at home is not a refusal of pleasure. It is a refusal to let two separate mental accounts make the same decision in different directions. To insist that food spending is food spending, regardless of which account it feels like it belongs to. And mental accounting has a culture perfectly suited to it, one that made the restaurant the social unit. For years, the social script has been the same. Dinner out is connection. Cooking at home is isolation, or frugality, or the choice you make when you can't quite manage the alternative. The person who never goes to restaurants is not someone who prefers their kitchen. They are someone who is missing something. Always cooking at home is not missing anything. It is the specific recognition that the connection available around a table you set yourself is identical to the connection available around a table someone else set, and that the difference in cost between those two tables is entirely the food and not at all the connection. And the numbers confirm what the kitchen already knew. A family of 4 substituting 3 restaurant meals per week with home-cooked ones reduces food spending by between $8,000 and $12,000 per year, a number that does not feel like the result of a small daily habit, and yet is exactly that. 3 forces. A brain that files restaurant spending under experience and cooking under cost, preventing the direct comparison that would make the decision obvious. A culture that reads the restaurant as the social default and the kitchen as the fallback. And a number, the annual total of what the restaurant version costs above the kitchen version, almost never calculated until it already exists. It was there the evening of making something at home that would have cost $60 at the restaurant where it usually came from. Not as a demonstration, not as a saving exercise, just because the ingredients were there and the evening had time, and finding that the version made in the kitchen was better than the version that arrived in a bag, and cost less than a quarter of what the bag had cost, and left the kitchen smelling like something had happened there, instead of something that had been delivered to it. It was there the dinner party at home, cooking for people rather than booking for people, and the specific quality of an evening that moved at its own pace, that allowed conversation to go wherever it needed to go, without the table being required for someone else at 9. And that cost a fraction of what it would have at a restaurant, without anyone noticing the difference, except in the way the evening felt. It was there the Sunday afternoon in the kitchen, something slow, nothing urgent, and the specific, quiet satisfaction of a refrigerator that already knew what the week was going to eat, before the week had begun to ask the question. It was there the month of not eating out at all, not as a challenge, just as the natural consequence of a kitchen that had become the obvious answer, in finding that nothing had been missed, that the food had been better, and that the month had cost considerably less than the ones before it. And it was there the ordinary Tuesday, a long day, nothing left, of opening the refrigerator and finding that the question had already been answered. Something was there, made the night before, or left from a batch not yet finished, and the specific, unremarkable relief of a kitchen that already knew what the evening needed, before the evening had arrived exhausted enough to reach for the delivery app instead. These are not people who don't enjoy eating out. Most of them go to restaurants. Some of them go to excellent ones, deliberately, for occasions that earn the cost. A birthday, a celebration, a meal that is genuinely about the place and not just the food. What they do not do is use the restaurant as the answer to the daily question of what to eat, as though the kitchen were a contingency and the delivery app were the plan. They are the person who, when someone suggests going out on a Wednesday night, gives an answer that slightly surprises, something close to this: "I've got something at home. Come over if you want." That is not someone who can't afford the restaurant. That is someone for whom the kitchen is the default and the restaurant is the exception. Not because eating out is wrong, but because eating in has long since stopped feeling like the lesser option. They do not calculate whether to cook or order. That question was answered a long time ago, not as a rule, just as the natural result of discovering that the kitchen version of almost every meal was better, cheaper, and more satisfying than they remembered it being, and that the restaurant version was better saved for the occasions that genuinely earned its cost, not the Tuesday when nobody felt like deciding anything. And the next time the question of where dinner is coming from arrives, that answer is already in the kitchen. Now finally, the objection. Eating out is part of life. Food is one of the great pleasures. You only live once. Cooking every meal at home sounds like a joyless way to save a few dollars. This is not about people who eat out for genuine reasons. Social occasions, celebrations, situations where the meal is the connection. If the restaurant is the right answer for that specific evening, nothing here argues against going. This is about the daily default of ordering or going out because cooking never quite made it to the top of the list of things worth doing. And the joyless argument carries less weight than it assumes. The people who cook every meal at home are not eating worse food. In most cases, they are eating better, more deliberately chosen, more carefully made,
more aligned with what they actually wanted than what was available at the place that was open and close enough. What is actually joyless is the Tuesday takeaway that nobody particularly wanted, ordered because the alternative felt like too much effort on a day that had already asked for too much. The people who always cook at home are not denying themselves pleasure. They simply stopped outsourcing the question of what to eat to a system that profits from the answer being expensive, and found that their own answer was usually better. Here is what most people get backwards. The person who eats out regularly, who treats the restaurant as the default, the delivery app as the plan, the kitchen as the backup, is not living more fully. They are outsourcing a daily decision to a system that charges significantly more for the very same dinner, and calling the premium the experience. The person who cooks at home is not missing the experience. They are having a different one that costs less, takes place in their own space, produces food made for them specifically by someone who knew exactly what they wanted, and ends when they decide it ends, not when the table is needed for the next booking. Most people treat cooking at home as the backup plan. These people treat eating out as the exception. And the person who made that particular inversion is not eating worse by any real measure that matters. They are simply eating entirely on their own terms, which turns out to be considerably less expensive than eating on everyone else's. There is a moment people who always cook at home all describe in almost the same way. It is not the first week the habit held. It is not the month the food budget first made sense. It is an ordinary evening, something cooking, the kitchen warm, the week already handled, and noticing, briefly, that the question of what to eat is not a question anymore. It was answered this morning, or yesterday, or at some point when there was time to think about it, and tonight it is simply what is already there. Not pride in the cooking, not satisfaction at the saving, just the specific, ordinary ease of an evening that knows what it is going to be, which turns out to feel considerably different from an evening that is still trying to figure that out at 7 o'clock. Not because restaurants aren't good, because the kitchen got better, or always was, and just needed to become the obvious answer instead of the fallback. The kitchen was never the point. What choosing it every time said about everything else was. 10 years from now, nobody asks how many restaurants you went to. They ask whether you knew how to feed yourself well, and whether the people you loved ever ate at your table. Do you cook every meal at home, and has anyone ever made you feel like that was the lesser choice? Drop it below. We read every single one.